All right, ladies and gentlemen, hello and welcome back once again to the only coast to coast radio show all about the information economy. It's time for Inside Analysis. Yours truly, Eric Kavanaugh, is here with a good buddy of mine, one of my besties from the Pittsburgh region, Andy Hanna, who has quite a pedigree. He's done a lot of really cool things. We're going to talk about the origin story for Blue Street Data. I came across Andy on LinkedIn, which is obviously the ideal networking platform in social media for business. Those folks have done an excellent job. They've also spun out some great technology. In fact, Apache Kafka, which is now everywhere under the stewardship of a company called Confluent, that came out of LinkedIn. That's the
Mm.
engine used to run LinkedIn. It was called Apache Kafka. It's now a huge source. And in fact, it's a source of data for one of my other clients, a company called Oceans. They just rolled out an announcement today. They landed another $49.4 million of investment, an extension of their Series B. And Chris Gladwin, their CEO, was telling me that Confluent is one of the big sources of data for their platform. So LinkedIn, good stuff. That's how I met Andy through one of his master's students at 1486 Labs. But he's got a longer origin story than that. And we'll kind of dive in. It'll be fun to remember where we've come from and how we got here. It's kind of hard to really wrap your head around the changes. They've been so significant and so compelling over the last 2 decades. But here we are. So with that, Andy Hanna from 1486 Labs and the University of Pittsburgh and Othot, welcome to Inside Analysis. How's it going?
Eric, thank you so much for inviting me. This is so much fun. I'm so excited to be on the show this afternoon and can't wait to chat with you about, the past really 30 years and
Right.
what's changed and how we've evolved over that time.
Yeah, and I remember a friend of mine came over to my apartment in New Orleans and was all purpose driven. He was like, "You are going to get on this thing." I'm like, "What are you talking about?" And it was the internet. And I was like, "All right." I had heard about it through Prodigy, in fact, when I was a newspaper editor in Lamont. One of my assistants was all into Prodigy, and it was like, "Oh, that is pretty interesting." And of course, it took off very, very quickly. But you'd have to think for a second, how did we get information before the internet? And the answer is on floppy drives and, other hard medium that you would carry around. And I was in the print
Printed
production
out.
business.
Yeah. I
So you
mean,
you couldn't use floppy drives. You had to use these big like portable discs. And I thought it was so cool to have my portable discs that I'd carry around because that was cool. But you were there too. So you remember the early days. How did we get information around back then?
sure. I mean, you're exactly right. Floppy disk. But I remember, if you were in financial services, you had multiple terminals on your desk, right? You had a Bloomberg terminal, you had a Thomson Reuters terminal, you had a terminal from Moody's. So it's like you couldn't even combine the sources or the systems in order to have one screen. You had to have multiple screens. It was a really inefficient time when it
Right.
came to retrieving data. I mean, I'm sure you remember if you wanted to give somebody a file, you had to stick it somewhere out there on the internet. Literally, you couldn't attach it to an email. If you remember,
Mhm.
you had to FTP it, right?
Right.
And then I had to say, hey, Eric, here's the secret passageway to where the information is on the internet. Go out there, grab it, and download it. I
Right.
mean, that's what the early 90s were like whenever you were trying to share information.
Yeah, and it's changed a lot. We're watching Young Sheldon now on Netflix, and they were just joking about that, how young Sheldon was on an FTP. And he's like
Hmm.
transferring files. And that's what you would do. And it moved pretty darn quickly. Once I remember the early days, we called them ASPs, right? Application service providers. And I
Hmm.
once had a smart guy on my show. I said, "What's the difference between ASP and software as a service?" And he goes, "SaaS works." I'm like, "Ah, okay. I get it. Smarty pants."
Yeah.
But the architecture's changed, and there's tremendous innovation that came out of companies like Yahoo in the early days, like Hadoop that went over
Yep.
to Google and really started this, or I should say, kickstarted the open source movement into very serious data territory, right? Because
Yeah.
Linux was the foundation of open source, and then 10 odd years later, you had this whole revolution in data management with Hadoop and a whole ecosystem around that. Of course, Apache Kafka is open source. And the channels for moving information have been rapidly advancing. We've got Snowflake now, we've got Databricks, we all have all these amazing companies that are allowing the use of analytics. But you and I have been there from the word go. So we remember what it was like to try to cobble this stuff together. And really, you have to constantly change your mindset about things and recognize that the times have changed and recognize you have to be using the new platforms as time goes by. And I guess that's an epiphany that you had as well, right?
That was in the mid 1990s, I would say right around 95. There's a really visionary guy, his name's Gary Mueller, wonderful guy who was doing research in Poland. And this is, remember, not too long after the fall of the Soviet Union. And the former Soviet countries all wanted to privatize their assets. So what Gary was doing research about a particular industry. And what he was finding is that there was a dearth of information. And so a bunch of us got together and said, okay, let's build this information infrastructure about the former Soviet Union.
Hmm.
So countries like Russia, Poland, Ukraine, the Czech Republic, et cetera. And what we did is we sent little teams into each of those countries, and they mined data. Literally, we got it somehow digitally, or we went to copy machines and actually copied it.
Wow.
And I'm serious, because it wasn't in existence. We had to go to banks, companies, analysts, and then we would consolidate it, and all in digital form. And we needed a way to distribute this information. We weren't going to do it over Bloomberg or Reuters. And so we said, hey, there's this really cool thing called the internet. Yahoo seems to be making it work. And so we literally we probably created one of the first SaaS-based applications out there. We put it on the
Wow.
web, and we got banks and large companies who wanted to invest or do business in the former Soviet Union. They connected into this database, and they paid per drink essentially.
Wow.
And so, meaning that every time that they went in, pulled information off, they would pay. It was a total gas. We had to put the first internet service provider, ISP, for all those who are kind of from a different generation, but we had to put the first ISP in Poland out there. We actually owned the first ISP in Poland.
Wow.
And so that was what it was crazy. It was a wild time, and it was pre-infrastructure. And
Hmm.
so we developed our own accounting systems. We developed our own distribution systems. It's kind of crazy. It's a lot of fun.
Yeah. Well, and you were at the very forefront of what is now called alternative data.
Mm.
And you and I have talked about this. I've done a lot of research into it. And, like you, I think down the road, like, how is this going to pan out? And clearly, the amount of alternative data being bought and sold today is just vast. It's stunning. And a lot of people don't realize that credit card companies sell what they call exhaust data, which is then bought by a whole variety of firms, most notably investment bankers. And so I wrote about this a number of years ago, saying that it's a pretty unfair playing field if these investment bankers can have all that data at their disposal, because now they can see, for example, who's going to meet or beat market estimates on revenue because they have the actual raw data and they can compare it to a baseline. So why don't we have some publicly facing consumer data lake, was my suggestion, so you could level the playing field and so the rest of us could all benefit from that. And you're kind of seeing the start of that in sort of in different places. And of course, you also have a history in the machine learning plus data space through this company called Othot, right? Tell us about that.
Yep, sure. I think one stop before then, I'll talk a little bit about sort of that transformation from data is powerful to data plus analytics, or AI is more powerful.
Mm-hmm.
And that was the time that I spent. A good friend of mine started a company called the International Institute for Analytics. His name's Jack Phillips, along with Tom Davenport, who we all know as sort of the guru in business analytics. And about 15 years ago, they came together and said, you know what, we need to be the leading research firm about how firms are using analytics, looking at the maturity of companies in terms of low versus high, and then whether or not they outperform companies that actually are less analytic. And the research holds true. The more analytic you are, the better you use data, the top of the heap you'll be. So good evidence of that is if we look at the top 10 companies of the S&P 500. These are the Metas, the Googles, the Microsofts, the Teslas. They're using data in a very different way. Amazon, and they represent 40% of the total value of the S&P 500.
Wow.
So they're the early adopters. They understood power of data, power of analytics together. And I feel very fortunate to spend time with Jack and Tom and and do some consulting in some very large companies and understand this transformation that was going on. And then me and a guy named John Abatico, a guy named Jeremy Garvey said, hey, we're going to do this. So 2014, we started this company called Othot. And the idea about Othot was, can we at scale take data about students, high school students, and help universities, colleges enroll the best fit students who are going to persist and graduate? And how can we help those institutions do better, right? Get more graduated on time, get better jobs, et cetera. So that's where we took machine learning coupled with all the rich data that high school students provide to universities, combine those two together, and we built Othot. And that was a 7 or 8 year journey.
Wow. Well, and just to explain to our audience here what you're able to do with data at scale and analytics, and especially machine learning, is of course identify patterns. But then the real magic is once you've identified a pattern, let's say a pattern of a successful student. Once you've identified that pattern, then you can sort of distill it, understand it as almost like a recipe, and then apply it to the rest of the data and see, aha, so these 40 out of 100 students actually fit that pattern of behavior in terms of interests, in terms of writing style. There are all sorts of different bits and pieces you can cobble together. And that's really the power of this analytical technology, right? Is that you can understand what works and what doesn't work. You can model both and then analyze current data to say, okay, according to our model that we've built, these 40 students are going to do very well. These 60, probably not so much. And you'll never get it completely right. I mean, there's, I think, a bit of a misconception that, oh, with all the best analytics, you'll always be right. No, you won't always be right, but you will greatly increase your chances of being correct, and you'll create what's called lift, right?
100%. So let's even maybe easier for the audience to understand is if we're looking at the probability of somebody to enroll, right? So let's say that Eric, we want you to enroll at the University of Pittsburgh. We see that you're 20% likely to enroll because that's what the machine learning has told us. And that's because of who you are and how you behave. So we know all the data about where you went to high school, your grades, the activities, et cetera. And then we see your behavior, right? So you're hitting website, what you're reading, the visits that you go to. Are you an engaged individual? So you land at this 20%. What we want to do, if this, we want Eric, we want him to be 80%. So we look at the prescriptions. What can we do that's going to increase his probability? So, for example, we might send you a particular marketing campaign, give you a particular scholarship, visit you in a high school, and all of a sudden, because we are studying the data and your patterns, just like you said, we see that those activities raise your probability from 20 to 80%.
Hmm.
This applies to every industry. This happens to be higher education that we're talking about, but this is how Amazon gets you to buy all the products that it gets you to buy through that recommendation engine.
Yeah, and what's cool is that you can learn about the students, so it's great for improving efficacy, but it's also great for educating the people who are involved in the process, right? Because when you play with
Mm.
these models, when you play with the data, that's when you start to understand how it all fits together, how the tumblers align. And I think we're at a very exciting time in our business world and the education world as well, because we've reached a bit of a critical mass in that regard, meaning we have the compute power now, we have tons and tons of data, we have smart people who have methodologies, who have published these methodologies that we can follow and understand. So it's really all coming together in terms of being able to leverage this stuff. And then you look at artificial intelligence, ChatGPT, large language models, which are of course very, very powerful. They are going to require some effort to govern and to manage responsibly. But I think we're
Huge.
up to the task now, right? Because of all this experience, because what we have is so valuable. And I think that transparency and ethics are really going to come into play here in the near future. What do you think?
Hugely, hugely important. I mean, one of the things that you said that people don't often get is it's not just about predicting the future. These models that you build allow you to diagnose where you might have issues. So you can detect bias right through
Mm.
these models. So if there's bias in the data or bias in the interpretation of the results, you can look at it and you can do some reverse engineering and say, hey, what if I change the gender? What if I change, do the results change? Oh, wow, this particular subsegment is disadvantaged because of that, because it just by changing the gender, which means that we have a problem, right? So then we've diagnosed it, now we can fix it. So, and I think that that's an area that we're really just starting to dive into so that we can understand how to fix the problems that exist. And by the way, we'll never fix all the problems. We just got to
Right.
focus on the big ones.
Yeah, well, and it's a journey, right? It's a process. And of course, when you fix one thing, other things break. It's like painting your house. You paint one wall, you got to paint them all, right? So it'll drive you
Mhm.
nuts unless you do that. But you're hitting on something very important, which I think is probably the most valuable proposition about AI and machine learning is that it helps you get to understanding the problems. That
Yeah,
discovery side is very challenging because it could be anywhere.
yeah.
I often use the example of you lose your wallet, you're looking for it all around the house. Is it even in the house? It's very frustrating because you don't know exactly where it is. You don't know where to look. That's kind of the way it is with large sets of data, too. You have to start filtering it and taking it a hard look at things. Like you said, let's flip out the gender, see if things change. Oh, wow, they changed dramatically. That's part of the process of working with the data, of trying to understand the data. And it takes effort. I mean, we're getting better and better with the technologies, but still it takes human beings in the loop analyzing the data. I'll give you a fun observation before our first break coming up in a minute. One good buddy of mine who also runs an analytics institute, he goes, "Yeah, machines don't have the ability to go, huh? That's kind of weird, but human beings do, right?"
Yeah, I mean that's a good point. At Othot, our chief data scientist Mark Fortman, he's actually developed what we call the automated data scientist. So he does the automated data scientist does exactly what you're talking about. It scans results, it scans data, it scans changes, model drift, and it says, "Aha!" It tells our people, "Aha, we got a problem over here." So it's like a member of the team,
Right.
which is how I think that we need to start thinking about AI as a member of the team and not an adversary.
That's a really, really good point, and we're up to our first break here, but don't touch that dial, folks. We're talking with Andy Hanna all about machine learning and data and the origin story of Blue Street Data. We'll be right back. You're listening to Inside Analysis. Okay, folks, back here on Inside Analysis with the one and only Andy Hanna of 1486 Labs. We'll get to that in just a minute. And of course, Othot. And in the break there, we're just chatting about the fact that data is changing, the nature of data is changing, and what we do with it is changing. You have these cycles basically, and I'll just throw one fun observation out there that I've seen in the recent past, which is observability. This whole space blew up called observability. And basically, it's just windows into feeds of machine data that's cruising around of things that are happening, connections to data sets, for example. And within like a year to 2 years of observability becoming a thing, there's already the company that sits on top of your observability data and allows you to manage it. So there's already a meta solution. We
Mm.
had them on the show last year that allows you it's called Mesmo, and they allow you to transform and process and correlate data streams from observability, right? So these are new ways of dealing with data. It's not all unstructured data like human text and images and things of this nature. A lot of it is machine data. So as they talk to each other, it's capturing that information. But the point is, this is all grist for the mill, as they say. And what data analysts and business people in general need to appreciate these days is that it is changing and it continues to change. So you have to kind of change the pace of your own processes and workflows and understandings to be able to leverage this stuff. And you'll never be completely up to date. You know what I mean? You're never going to be riding the crest of the wave for any significant time because everything is changing all around us. So you kind of have to be very agile and very open minded. And by the way, put some governance into place, right? Governance, I think, is going to be a hugely popular topic for many years to come because we're in such a turbulent time and because the outcomes are still relatively unknown. Well, if you don't have governance and you flip the switch of AI on in AI on in your organization, you're going to get some crazy stuff flying out the other end. It's not going to work well for you. But give me your thoughts on that, the changing nature of the data landscape and how you have to change with it.
Yeah, so we're I think we're really lucky that we've seen the evolution of this technology and the source of the power of that technology, which is the data. over the past 40 years, right? So if you go back 40 years, we know, Yahoo had just been going public, or just formed. So we've come a long way since those first days. And even if it's only 2 decades since Yelp and Twitter have been around, and really the growth of that and the use of that data is over the past decade. So the ability, and the examples that you give are wonderful, Eric, but the ability to think about the use of that data that didn't exist, that user level data did not exist until a decade ago.
Hmm.
And so the ability for, and we see that, as we mentioned, of the top companies in the country using that data to understand behavior and to change that behavior, to increase probability of buying, those types of things. How do we, how does the rest of the world, and maybe this is a good question for you, we know it's like the rich getting richer, and how does the poor move up, right? Because these large companies are the ones who are pushing the edges of technology and the use of data, when the 80% of the companies that are out there are still trying to understand digital transformation. And what can I do with that data? They're learning about the use cases and the applications. Are we going to continue to have this huge divide so that the true value that's driven by AI and data is really housed in a small number of companies? What do you think, Garrick?
I mean, that's a very, very big question. I think transparency is going to be the key. I think this idea I threw at the top of the hour of a consumer-facing data lake basically would be interesting because it's a place where we can all dive in and sort of better understand what's happening with this data and ownership. Data ownership is a big issue these days.
Mm.
You're starting to see some of the bigger companies at least give lip service to this, but allowing you to own your data, giving you control of when your data can be used to train algorithms, for example. There are lots of people coming up with business models to allow you to own your data and control that. But it's hard. It's going to be hard to unseat the Amazons and the Microsofts and the Googles of the world. But I will tell you that the big guys are nervous too. There is tremendous tension at Google right now. They are very nervous about what just happened with ChatGPT in particular, and then Microsoft stepping in to buy it basically, or invest heavily in it, I should say. And then what happened? The board for OpenAI kicks out Sam Altman, and over the course of the weekend, Satya Nadella offers to hire him, and you're just like, "Holy Christmas,
Chaos.
what is going on?"
Yeah. Yeah.
But we do need transparency, and I think that while I fully respect the concept of intellectual property and having to protect these sorts of things, you get right down to it. These models are so incredibly complex that you could offer complete transparency, and I don't think you're jeopardizing your business model really much at all. And in fact, I just heard today that apparently Elon Musk is going to open source Grok. Of course, Mark Zuckerberg open sourced Llama or Llama 2. So, again, you kind of see these movements. And I just read today that who is it? I think Google is following suit and allowing you to exit their data centers, right? Because there are all these exit fees basically that were just killing people. I mean, that was the big joke is you can put all your data in the cloud for cheap, but if you try to take it out, those egress fees were going to hammer you. So
Hmm.
I do think there's pressure on the big guys, but I think you're right that we need to be very careful. And there was concern, what if this kind of LLM capability is restricted to a handful of people? Well, that would be a pretty bad situation, I think. We all want access to these technologies, and I think it's good that we have competition at the highest levels that's pushing towards that transparency, but I think transparency and education are the two massive keys to success to give power to the little people out there. What do you think?
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that that's a tall order. I think, that we were talking earlier about data warehousing, and, there's still lots of companies trying to figure out what's my single source of truth, as
Right,
opposed to thinking about what's the latest in architecture that I can use both external data and internal data to outcompete those who are in my space.
right.
So I look across the spectrum of companies, and I am just floored by how the distribution of capabilities, the distribution of knowledge, There are so many companies that are just at the beginning of this journey, and you and I, understand this the end of the journey because we work with the larger companies who are on the edge. We understand retail media networks, and we understand data clean rooms and data fabric and all this. But most companies are going to Gartner's annual conference to learn about what the heck these things are, let
Right.
alone being able to gain value out of this technology. So I completely agree with you, the transparency and the education. I just don't know how it's going to happen without mechanisms to say, okay, here's how you can get value, and then let's help each other, like on fraud, as an example. We can share knowledge about fraud detection, right? It's do we want to compete on fraud detection? I hope not. I hope
Right.
that's something that we want to share. So why don't we have a common way of looking at fraud and helping each other in every industry understand where there's fraudulent customers and or customers that don't even exist? And so I think we have to figure out a way to get people to that base camp of use cases and
Hmm.
understand how they work.
I like the concept, the base camp of use cases. You're absolutely right about fraud. I've talked about that on this show even 15 years ago with the same exact thought. It's like, let's share threat detection data, at least within industries, in the financial services, in healthcare, and insurance, in different industries where they're the same business model. Let's share information about threats because they can spread very quickly and they can bring companies down. I mean, you were hearing all these stories about ransomware and just terrible things that are happening of people stealing your data, stealing access to your data, and causing all kinds of trouble. But I will say the good news is that the young people today, they're all on their iPhones, they're on their Samsungs, they're on their different devices, and they understand technology as a first class citizen. Whereas a lot of us, middle-aged folks, let's say, we've had the whole journey of knowing what it was like before even computers, for crying out loud, before that was
Mhm.
mainstream. We're like reading books and you do have to, I think every so often gut check yourself and mind check yourself and say, all right, do am I still lingering in these old habits? And the answer is you probably are. So how do you shake out of that? And I think you do it by listening to people and just by going to events and going to webinars and things and just taking a moment to hear what other people are talking about and to see and to watch how they interact with data. That's why I'm so excited about transparency of data sets, and it's really come a long way in the last, I'd say, 10 years. And you guys, of course, are part of this. But transparency data, because it's only once you really start playing around, or as they say, munging the data, that you start to get a better understanding for what that process is like and how it really does take time. Even
Mm.
if you have the best technologies, it takes time to play around, flatten things, move things around, see it in motion, but that's when
Engineer it.
you
Mhm.
start to get it and you're like, oh, wait a minute. And that's the beginning of a career, right?
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, a lot of people don't know this. We now have a major, an analytics major at the University of Pittsburgh for undergraduate business students.
That's awesome.
These students are coming in their freshman year and they're learning to program in Python. They're learning how to mine data. They're learning how to use that data and you know uh, different models to make decisions. I mean, so they're graduating with a language that most people at the organizations that they're going into only casually understand. So
Right.
I find that as a very interesting sort of, you have this group of really fluent in technology new hires, and then up two levels people are their level of knowledge is what they've read, from McKinsey or from something from towards data science or something like that. So they're getting the nuance of it, but they haven't lived it. So
Right.
how do we deal with that in these companies, that divide between sort of three level? I'm not talking about upper management. I'm even talking about two or three levels up in those new hires, and that ability to translate what one set knows versus what the other doesn't.
Yeah. Well, I tell you, one of the lessons of life that I've taken away is you got to realize that you do have to reset and recognize there are a lot of things that you don't know and embrace the change, I suppose. And I try to do it on these shows by talking to smart people. Of course, you are in the university space, so you're talking to the next generation of business executives. I mean, that's who these folks are. If you take a master's in in analytics, you're going to go somewhere in business. I'm quite sure you're going to have a pretty good career path ahead of you, and it's going to be constantly changing. So, understanding the data, understanding, as you've said, the use cases, the base camp of use cases, and that's of course what you're providing with 1486 Labs, right?
Yeah, so that the idea, we're very fortunate. We have a company named Liaison based in Boston, an ed tech company, really focused on helping the student journey and become successful. It solved the value in Othot, and they purchased Othot about 2.5 years ago. I still remain as a president of the AI division, really looking at the next generation of products. And so with that, I also have a lot of flexibility to be creative. And so what I wanted to do in combining sort of what Liaison does in creativity around the data and analytics side, and the resources, especially the young, sort of very energetic and very knowledge thirsty students, put together an entrepreneurial lab where we will develop companies at the intersection of data and analytics. And that's, 1486 Labs is all about that. So we have 21 interns right now, and they're building our first company, which is called Blue Street Data. And Blue Street Data is aimed directly at how do we make it easier for the buyers of data to understand what they're buying and what they need to buy in order to make these use cases work? What powers those use cases? How do we understand it? And how do we get the right, best, highest quality, lowest price data to power those use cases?
Yeah, and that's really important. I can tell you that in my industry, I've tried a couple times over the years, and I was nervous each time to buy data sets of contact information. It's a very dicey thing to do. You typically get very low quality data, and it's just hard to know. I mean, you get all these different companies offering it. It's like, well, how did you get that data? Where did you find it? These days, there are technologies like seamless AI that we use somewhat extensively, which are quite compelling. It's almost like an engine that spins up a real-time yellow pages for you to find contact information. And it's real time. It's not just a repository like a big data set. It's a set of algorithms that in the moment will reach out and capture information. And they do persist a lot of it. But you have to ask yourself the question, like, how good is this data? And that's the service you're providing, is being able to act as a liaison or a shepherd or a Sherpa or something to help people understand what are the use cases, when do you use this stuff, for what purpose do you use this stuff, how do you use it? You have to be careful about how you use these things. But I can tell you, buying email databases, buying email lists, very bad idea.
Yeah.
Like, you cannot just throw that stuff into production. I mean, if anything, you can use it as a starting point to start looking around and finding people. But there's a lot of work to be done, folks. There's a lot of time and effort that goes into this, and you have to be careful about how you spend your time. But don't touch it. That will be right back. You're listening to Inside Analysis. All right, folks, back here on Inside Analysis with Andy Hanna of 1486 Labs and Othot and the University of Pittsburgh, and of course, Blue Street Data. And Andy, you were just saying in the break there that you are now looking at data quality through some new lenses. That's one thing that machine learning is very good at, by the way, is finding mistakes. People are looking for use cases for LLMs. Finding mistakes in your code is really good stuff. You can just throw a bunch of code, say, where's the mistake? It'll find it. So there are lots of things these engines do that are not just text or image generative in nature. That's for fodder for another show. We'll do a show in a couple of weeks on that. But really dive into the quality conversation, because quality is so important with data. Think about when you get an outreach and they misspell your name or something. That's not a good customer experience. What are you doing to improve quality and to vet the quality of data sets?
Yeah. So I think this is a really interesting topic because when we first started to attack this angle, we went to all the typical sort of metrics around quality, the consistency, the comparability, the timeliness, et cetera, everything that everybody thinks about. And as we were exploring it, we came to realize that, hey, so much of the quality of data is dependent on the particular use case and how important that use case is to the business. So it becomes very individualized. It becomes very difficult. Like you said, Eric, there's great technologies out there to do anomaly detection, right? Or to find missing values or whatever it may be. But you often can't use those techniques unless you get the full data set. You can do it on a sample, but as we know, sample rarely represents the full data set. So, one of our advisors is Malcolm Hawker, who you know well. And we started thinking about how do we need to approach quality? And this takes me back to sort of some of my days in a company called Plextronics, where you look at the supplier, right? And you start to evaluate what is the process that the supplier has in order to ensure that it's delivering a top-notch product, right? So it is the processes behind it. How many sources do you use before you say, hey, I have a valid sleeve of data related to a particular attribute? So it is that, and is it transparent? Do they tell us how they do it? What's the source of the data? Is it an ethically sourced data? What's the quality of the company itself? And then, of course, we look at the expert opinion about the database or the data set or the data product, depending of people who've actually used it before, the pros and the cons. So when you put that sort of how we make the product together with expert opinion, you have a much different view of quality than we typically look at when we're trying to find these anomalies or problems with the data sets.
So it's like, to a certain extent, that it's an expert crowdsourced view of quality, because it's not just random, let's say, Yelp reviewers, and
Yeah.
many of those can be fake. No, you have trusted sources that you rely upon to give you sophisticated analysis of data sets, right?
That coupled with, are they transparent in the process that they use to make the product? If
Hmm.
if you think about the material science world, you have the spec of the product has to be on, and you go in and you explore the manufacturing process of the manufacturer. That's what ISO is all about. We need that ISO type of concept here with data production. It's just like thinking about a product that any company might produce.
Well, that's interesting, because you're kind of hinting at or alluding to observability. Right? That's
100%.
when we
Yeah.
talk about observability in the data world, what you're really talking about is getting windows into streams of information, and then being
Mhm.
able to correlate those to understand what happened. So, this is what I love about open source. That's why I always tout open source, and I'm a huge fan for lots of different reasons. One is because many eyes make few the errors, or as the old expression goes, bad code goes away.
Mhm.
Right, that's one of the benefits of open source. Now, there are downsides, which is it's hard to make money. And like, if you're
Mhm.
open sourcing the code, how do you ensure that you get the money? we we were joking a couple years ago that Amazon was strip mining the open source community and not doing a lot for it. They have since changed their tune somewhat, and now they kind of understand, which gets us back to ethics, right? And to being
Mhm.
ethical in how you run your business, how you run your operations. And there are these sort of competing virtuous and vicious cycles, it seems to me. And we want to put the balance of power in the virtuous circles, where good virtue breeds good virtue, which breeds good virtue, and it keeps going up. But there is always this downward pressure of the vicious cycles. And how do you solve that? I think you
Mhm.
solve it through good ethical constructs and transparency and just ongoing work. Basically, it's never going to be solved. You got to keep hammering away at it, right?
Yeah, and the transparency, as we've talked about, I think every single segment here is critically imperative. It's transparency and what the data is, how you're using it, how it's produced. But you said something that's kind of interesting that I think a lot about, which is you used the word sleeves of data. And the more that I talk, I probably talk to a dozen people every week in the industry about external data. And one of the most common things are that I have to typically, as a buyer, buy bundles of data. I want streams of data. I want particular data elements. Yeah, I'll have to find a way to make sure my matching algorithms are able to append my existing database. I get that. But why do I have to buy the whole enchilada when I just want, the guacamole or whatever it might be? What a bad analogy, but you get what I mean.
Okay.
Is it's like, so you want that, you want the ability to slice down into the individual, into the granular level. And we really don't have that. That's not the way that data and information has been sold in the past.
Mm.
And so we have to move to that type of granularity, to the individual level data element. And
Hmm.
that's going to be hard. That's going to be hard for a lot of the existing companies who are doing it the old way to transform. But if we do it in the right way, we're going to be able to say, oh, for this use case, here's a particular element you need to buy. You can buy the best data, and it's just a stream off of this company that's never sold data in the market before.
Hmm.
Because so we give that opportunity for those types of companies to come to market with their data with a particular use that's better than anything else that's out there. That's the way to think about restructuring of the data markets, which
Hmm.
we desperately need if we're going to move to the next level of value from data.
That's very interesting. And I was mentioning before, you're seeing early indicators for this kind of technique or of standard, if you will. And one of which is like Google with your timeline and how Google will now give you your timeline, right? I mean, I think Twitter allows you to download your tweets, other platforms allow you to kind of download things, and there is value to that. But being able to reflect back to the user, Amazon is actually pretty good at this, at being able to capture all of your transactions, very quickly show you where they are, so you can go find things. Or you think about all the stuff you used to have to keep track of yourself, and now you realize, oh, okay, well, they're going to keep track of that for me, like a
Yeah,
web portal for the hospital, for example. I don't have to write down everything for my wife's appointments. I know it's up in the cloud, so I can go there. And I think the more we learn to trust those sources and rely on those sources, the more we'll be able to focus on what we're trying to do and not worry about trying to do all the other stuff that other people are doing for us, right?
100%. Yeah, and it gets down, you're right. So the way that we capture information has dramatically improved over the past decade. The way that we store it so that we can track it down to any individual is what gives us the power to be able to do this. It's going to open up a whole bunch of different revenue models. It's going to open up a whole bunch of different companies. I mean, we're really flooded with Gen AI companies right now, but I think the underlying sort of hidden gold is what companies are doing very creative things with the data to make it much more usable.
Hmm.
And when you can combine that value of that usable data with these technologies, just like we've seen over the past 40 years, companies will emerge that will disrupt their industries, will
Hmm.
disrupt the other companies that they compete against.
Yeah. No, that's right. And I think it's going to be amazing. I think that all the tumblers are aligning right now, and it's kind of wild. I think the more people get access to useful data sets, like a data sleeve, as you're talking about, just a little piece to fill in a gap, the more success you have with that, the better. The problem is that people do get burned. I mean, one of my partners does content syndication, and I trust this guy as much as I trust any human being in the world. He's incredibly professional. He's been around a long, long time. And the projects they've done with us have been spectacular. I mean, the quality of leads is amazing, but it's still hard to sell. Why? Because people have been burned in the past.
Yeah.
And once you get burned, once bitten, twice shy, basically, it's hard to kind of move past that. I mean, with chatbots, you're kind of seeing this right now. Chatbots are coming back with some vigor. They first came out. I mean, they first came out like 15 years ago. In the earliest days, they were just
Terrible.
dreadful, right? It was just
Terrible.
horrible. It's like, what is going on here? These
Mhm.
people are making me crazy. So it's like well, it's like Pittsburgh still to this day, to people who have never been here. Like, oh, isn't it a dirty city? I'm like, oh my God, no, it's not a dirty city. It hasn't been dirty it was from the steel days, and that ended, in terms of the toxins and all that stuff. That's this distant past now, but it takes a long time for these things to die. Well, podcast bonus segment is coming up next, but don't touch that dial. You're listening to Inside Analysis. All right, folks, back here, time for the podcast bonus segment here with Andy Hanna of 1486 Labs and Othot and the University of Pittsburgh. And we're talking all about AI and data and ethics. And speaking of, everyone's talking about responsible AI and ethical AI. And, it's good because we need to have these conversations. And you, my friend, were recently given the chair of, what is it, the University of Pittsburgh's Responsible Data Science Board. Is that right? Tell us about that.
That is right. So we're really fortunate at the University of Pittsburgh, where we have a lot of individuals that are focused on data science and artificial intelligence. What we're focused on in a responsible data science community is three things. How do we make sure that the infrastructure behind all these models, et cetera, are responsible from a curriculum perspective, from a research perspective, from a workforce development perspective? So we want to lead the nation on how we think about the deployment of all these technologies, regardless of whether you're in academia or you're in business. My responsibility as chair of the advisory board is to bring industry into the conversation. So that very thoughtful approach that says that we can't do this in a vacuum. So if we're working on, and we literally use words, we're working on use cases and data sets to show how you can responsibly use the techniques that we've been talking about and solve real problems. And so, and those real problems come from industry. So we're focused on retail, finance, and healthcare, and what I'll call civic applications of this technology.
That's pretty cool. When I think about policies, and I'm glad you're saying you're bringing the business world into this because that's really what it takes. Because you and I can have all sorts of theories about how things operate in a particular industry, but until you sit down with people from that business, you're probably not going to be able to figure out some of the really critical components of processes and workflows, and they will tell you. I mean, I remember just as an example, many years ago, I was at a meeting. I used to represent the downtown development district of New Orleans, and we're in a meeting with the new executive director and a whole bunch of other people. Stakeholders are there, including a lieutenant from the police force and a bunch of other people. And the new executive director was like, "Yeah, we decided we're going to come up with our own police force, and they're going to, handle these stuff downtown." And you can imagine the lieutenant of the police force in New Orleans said, excuse me, what are you going to do? That's our
Mm-hmm.
responsibility. Why? Like, what are you talking about here? They've never even broached the subject with them. And it's like, that's kind of a problem. If you sit down with people in private first and have conversations or even have hearings, for example, to vet these issues, that's the way to get there and make sure you have the stakeholders at the table because they're the ones who are going to recognize those red flags. It sounded like a great idea in the other boardroom, but when you share it in the bigger context, you realize, oh, I guess there are some problems with that. That's the point of having these meetings, right?
Yeah, 100%. And we have to look at it from every angle in terms of responsibility. And so the lens, when I think about that concept of responsible, I really think about it from three different lenses. The first one is purpose. Why are we using this technology? What is the big reason why we're using this technology? Is it to solve organizational, societal issues, or is it to cause some type of catastrophic harm? Right. I mean, that's the easiest way to think about it. So purpose is number one. So have that perspective. The second one is all about ethics. So it's what is the intent of the individuals involved in the project? Are they looking to benefit the society or benefit the company or benefit or everything that they're doing? Is it leaning towards the good as opposed to the bad?
Right.
And then the last piece is about avoiding bias or having anyone treated unfairly. And that's a really interesting piece of it because that's where we go back all the way to the beginning of our conversation on the diagnosis. Where are people being disadvantaged because of this technology? And so if we can combine that purpose and ethics and fairness together, we're going to have a very powerful and reliable and trustworthy set of technologies and data that we can then build the next generations of business on.
Yeah, you just reminded me of Immanuel Kant's categorical imperative. You may
Mm-hmm.
recall,
I
act
do.
only on that maxim, which you can at the same time will as universal law, which is a nuanced approach of do as you would be done by. Basically, it's like
Mm-hmm.
if you were going to engage in a policy, ask yourself, would it be reasonable for every other company to engage in the same policy? And if the answer is
Mm-hmm.
yes, then ethically speaking, you're on pretty solid ground, right?
Mm-hmm. And first, I like the physician's oath, right? So first, we do no harm,
Right.
right? So if you literally have that in your mindset, and so I think that the diversity of people around the problem is a really critical one. So if you have a bunch of people that are the same gender, same ethnicity, same level of wealth, whatever it is, trying to solve a problem, you're not going to get a diverse view of the problem. So the people around the problem and the techniques that we use to determine whether or not somebody could be treated unfairly, the combination of those two things is very powerful.
Mhm. And you have to kinda maintain an ongoing balancing act, right? Because you can also overreact to things, and that's something we see a lot in our world is pendulum swings one way, and then it swings the other way, and it swings one way, and it swings the other way, and, for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction, so you kinda have to take all that into consideration and just be reasonable, right? I mean, there's something
Mm,
to be said for being a reasonable person, for understanding there are differences, and not everyone's out to get you and all these kinds of things. You do have to keep that all in mind. But I think the real key is, as you suggest, bring an ethically oriented mindset. What are we trying to do? How are we trying to do it? And then honestly gauging the success. Is it working? I mean, there's nothing like the law of unintended consequences to give you a real humdinger, right? You think you're doing the right thing and it all falls apart. I mean, have
mhm.
you ever seen the video of Yellowstone when they let the wolves back in? Have you seen that video?
No, I have not.
Look it up, man. It'll absolutely blow your mind. They did a study and they brought wolves back to Yellowstone National Park, and they said the results were absolutely mind-blowing. You have to get into it to understand, but basically it reset the balance of power amongst all the different animals that were there. The creeks came back, all sorts of things happened that absolutely blew people's minds, which shows you it's kind of like the butterfly's wings effect, right? One little change can have a very big impact, but you have to be open to the change and you have to be open to tracking the change and just being realistic. And that's what business is all about, right? In the business, you have to be pragmatic. If
Mhm.
you go too far in one direction, you're not going to be in business anymore. But final thoughts, how do people find out more about Blue Street Data and 1486 Labs?
Yeah, so easy, go to www.bluestreetdata.com or www.1486labs.com. You can learn about us from 1486, how we're building next generation of companies with really great students. And of course, Blue Street Data, how we facilitate the purchase of high quality, right priced data that can drive analytic engines.
I love it. Folks, talk to you next time. You've been listening to Inside Analysis.